There's a place hidden beneath the very heart of Rome that most people will never see, not without special permission. It's not a museum. It's not a chapel. It's not even marked on most maps. It's a vault, a deeply buried sanctuary of memory, sealed behind layers of iron doors and thick stone walls that refuse to echo. Inside, time itself is preserved, not celebrated, not displayed, just kept. For over 12 centuries, the Vatican has protected millions of documents in this underground archive. These aren't dusty scrolls about saintly miracles or church hymnals. These are handwritten letters from popes that were never sent. Banned books that once shook the world. Records of visions and apparitions dismissed in silence. Quiet whispers exchanged between the Holy See and Emperor's fascists' spies. And art, stunning art that no one has ever seen. The question isn't what the Vatican is keeping. It's why they've never spoken of it. This is not a story about conspiracy. This is about memory. About the weight of truth when it's too heavy to carry into the light. Welcome to Secrets of the Vatican Archives. You won't hear retellings here. No recycled tales from textbooks. This is about what was meant to be hidden. And for a short time, I was one of the few who had access to it. I wasn't a cardinal, not a scholar. I didn't wear robes or titles. I was just a custodian, a custode as they say in Italian. I cleaned. I ran errands. I handed out approved pages to researchers. But there were nights, quiet ones, when the oil lamp flickered and the old priest at the front desk dozed off. On those nights, I turned the keys no one else dared to touch. I opened doors I was never supposed to open. From that moment, I was changed. Now, as my own time grows short, my heart slower, my hands less steady, I know I must speak. Not to accuse, not to shock, not even to defend, but so that someone out there might understand what I saw. You see, truth doesn't belong entirely to the light. It doesn't belong to the shadows, either. It lives in the space between. Quiet. Waiting. I've seen the letters Pope Pius XII never sent. Sat before forbidden books that once shook the church to its roots. And I've stood speechless before paintings by Caravaggio too painful to hang. Paintings where the eyes don't look up at heaven, but straight into a kind of suffering that even theology refuses to acknowledge. And that's the most haunting thing. What's hidden here isn't false. It's too true to be accepted. I don't ask you to believe me. I have no official proof to offer. Only this: if something inside you still wonders, still feels that under every polished sermon and marble statue, there's something raw, unresolved, and real, then maybe this is for you. Because one day those iron doors will open, and when they do, you'll understand why I never went back. Like many people, I used to see the Vatican as a symbol, a holy fortress, white-robed popes waving to crowds in St. Peter's Square. But that image, grand as it is just the surface. Beneath the domes, behind the marble, hidden behind locks with triple mechanisms, lies something else, the Vatican's secret archive. Or as it's officially called in Latin, Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. Now don't be misled. Secretum doesn't mean secret the way we use it today. It means private. This archive belongs personally to the Pope, not the whole Catholic Church. And that privacy, that exclusivity has given rise to centuries of speculation, from wild conspiracies to serious historical investigations. It spans 85 kilometers of shelving, over 35,000 distinct entries, documents dating from the 8th century all the way to modern day. And yet, only a small sliver is open to scholars. The rest, the most sensitive, the most charged, remains sealed, waiting in the deeper vaults. That's where the real stories live. One of the most famous items stored here is a copy of a letter Galileo Galilei sent to the church in 1613. In it, he tried to explain that his views on astronomy didn't contradict the Bible. The church wasn't convinced. In 1616, Heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun, was declared heretical. By 1633, Galileo stood before the Inquisition. The tribunal that tried him, its proceedings are all here, bound in fading parchment. Another infamous case is the trial of the Knights Templar in the 1300s. For centuries, people believed the Church had destroyed all evidence of the proceedings. But in 2001, Italian scholar Barbara Frail uncovered a bombshell, the Chinon parchment. A document showing Pope Clement V had secretly absolved the Templars. It had been hidden for over 700 years. Why? Because it would have rewritten everything we thought we knew about the Church's role in their downfall. There are letters, hundreds of them, between the Vatican and Nazi Germany. Reports sent from bishops inside the Third Reich describing atrocities against the Jewish people. The Holy See knew, and yet their response was at best complicated. Torn between faith, political calculation, and fear. In 2020, after decades of pressure, the Vatican finally opened the archives relating to Pope Pius XII, who led the Church through World War II. Historians hoped the truth would finally surface, and it did, but not in black and white. What emerged was a pope who acted but quietly, who saved lives but silently, who chose discretion over condemnation. And still the debate rages, was that wisdom or moral failure? The archive doesn't answer. It preserves. But not everything here is about war and heresy. Some of it is simply human. There are sketches by Michelangelo, personal letters by Mary Queen of Scots, a farewell from a Native American chief in the 1800s, maps of churches that no longer exist, blueprints of lost fortresses and catacombs, records of entire dioceses that disappeared after war or plague. Some of these documents raise questions that history has never answered, like the siege of Montségur in 1244 during the Cathar Crusade. There's a floor plan of the monastery, and on it, a strange unrecorded escape route. Did someone survive? No one knows. The archive won't say. It just holds the map. Each year, only 60 to 80 scholars are allowed inside. They apply. They specify their topic. They follow the rules. No photos, no copies, no documents removed. And even then, they'll only see what's been approved. No one, not even the Pope, has free rein, because the most sacred vaults stay closed, not out of secrecy, but because some truths once told would shake the very foundations of faith. If there's a single document that truly captures the weight of what's hidden in the Vatican archives, it might be the records tied to one of the greatest divides in Christian history, the Reformation. Few people know this, but in the early 1500s, long before Martin Luther's break became irreversible, there were secret attempts, genuine urgent attempts on both sides to reconcile. The Vatican preserved handwritten correspondence, still stored in sealed dossiers, between reformers and Vatican representatives. These weren't public manifestos or theological rebukes. They were private letters, drafted in slanted brown ink, cautious in tone but earnest in spirit. One Dutch scholar who studied these documents once broke into tears, not out of religious allegiance, but because they revealed that the fracture between Protestantism and Catholicism wasn't inevitable. At one point, it was preventable. Among the files is a report from Bishop Girolamo Aleandro, dispatched to negotiate with Lutheran factions in the German principalities. He even proposed rare concessions, radical, for the time to keep the Church unified. But when Luther's reply came back calm but firm, the talks broke down. Pride, power, and politics took over. That entire episode remains sealed to most. The documents require advanced credentials and a very specific research justification. But they're there, just waiting. Another section of the archive that left a permanent mark on me was the vast collection from the Inquisition. It's not one box, it's not one shelf. It's rooms, thousands of indictments, interrogations, and verdicts spanning 7 centuries. One of the most haunting cases is that of Giordano Bruno. a philosopher, astrologer, and early advocate for the idea of an infinite universe. The Church saw his ideas as dangerous not just scientifically, but spiritually. The transcripts of his trial are meticulous, painfully so. In one internal note, a cleric scribbled, "If we spare him, doctrine will waver. But if we burn him, history will never forgive us." They burned him anyway, Campo de Fiori, and for centuries the silence that followed became one of the clearest examples of the Church's struggle between knowledge and obedience. The archives hold that silence, and they hold more. When Napoleon marched into Italy, he ordered Vatican documents packed up and shipped to Paris. Thousands of crates. Some never returned. The ones that did still considered highly classified. In a quiet corner of the archive, I once held a charcoal ink letter written by Pope Pius VII during the plundering. In tiny script it read, "We have been stripped bare." It's a phrase I've never forgotten. But history doesn't just flow from Europe to Rome. Few people know that in the 1600s, the Vatican secretly exchanged letters with the Tokugawa shogunate of Japan even while Christianity was banned. The letters were sent via Portuguese missionaries concealed inside wooden statues to avoid detection. One letter dictated by Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1611 read, "We do not accept a faith that divides families, but we respect the loyalty your missionaries show." That letter sits in the archive like a monument to a diplomatic conversation that never blossomed. There's a section devoted to blueprints, to architectural memory maps of lost churches, vanished abbeys, and obliterated monasteries. One that haunts me still is a floor plan of Montségur Abbey, the final stronghold of the Cathars. On it, someone centuries ago marked an escape tunnel. It doesn't appear in any other records. No one knows if anyone used it. But there it is, a silent possibility that maybe someone survived. Then there's the political section, the archives tied to global diplomacy. One vault contains neat rows of boxes, each labeled by country, each filled with classified records of Vatican relations stretching from the 1800s to modern day. Most people don't realize that for nearly 60 years, between 1870 and 1929, the Vatican had no official diplomatic status. The Papal States were absorbed into Italy. The popes never left the Vatican walls, and yet they continued to communicate often in secret with governments across the world. One document from 1922 reveals the Vatican offered to mediate disputes between the United States and Catholic nations in post-WWI Europe before it was even a state. That document still has the red wax seal, still bears the Pope's signature, still whispers of influence even when silent. When the 20th century arrived, so did darker records. The archives from World War II are some of the most heavily scrutinized, and still many remain sealed. Dozens of reports from bishops in Poland, France, and Germany paint a horrifying picture of the Holocaust long before it was widely acknowledged. In 1942, Cardinal Adam Sapieha, future mentor to Pope John Paul II, wrote to Rome, "If we do not speak, we will be complicit before God." The Vatican's response, recorded in barely a paragraph, said only, "We pray. That is what we can do." A document I later found, authored by a papal advisor, made it painfully clear if faith becomes political, we risk losing the faithful. In other words, they feared division more than condemnation. The silence would last until the Second Vatican Council, when the Church finally began to confront its own hesitations. That council, Vatican II, holds one of the largest and most complex collections in the entire archive. Thousands of pages, fierce debates, ideas once considered heresy discussed as potential doctrine. One transcript recorded a fiery exchange over whether Latin should remain the universal language of Mass. A cardinal argued, "If we abandon Latin, we abandon eternity." Another shot back, "If we don't change, we abandon the people." The council also marked the beginning of interfaith dialogue with Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, even atheists. In one drawer, I found a draft of a speech by Pope Paul VI meant to be an apology for the Church's silence during the Holocaust. But that version was never read. Only a note remains scribbled in the margin, Tempus nondum est. The time has not yet come. And then there are the archives documenting colonialism. From the 15th to the 19th century, the Vatican was not just a spiritual power. It was part of global empire. One of the most chilling documents is the papal bull Inter Caetera, issued in 1493, just a year after Columbus landed in the New World. It divided the non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal. A map of the globe carved up by faith and conquest. Alongside it, I found letters from popes requesting that new colonies protect missionaries and allow the spread of the gospel. But interspersed in the same files were anguished cries from missionaries who saw the violence firsthand. One letter from Bartolomé de las Casas to Pope Paul III in 1537 recounts atrocities in the Caribbean. "The churches are built upon blood," he wrote. That same year, the Pope issued Sublimis Deus, a decree declaring that indigenous people were human, with souls deserving of freedom and the gospel. It was a progressive move, but it was quickly withdrawn. The European monarchs weren't ready to let go of slavery. The Vatican didn't give direct orders for conquest, but it gave legitimacy. It gave blessing. And that, too, is power. Even in the 19th century, files from Vietnam show the Vatican walking a thin line supporting missionaries, while watching as colonial governments used faith as a tool of influence. In one 1833 report about a Catholic-led rebellion, a line stood out. "We must not allow faith to become entangled with rebellion." But faith already had. The archive doesn't erase that. It simply keeps the paper trail intact, and in doing so, it holds a mirror not just to the Church, but to history itself, to how belief and power can merge, and to how even the most sacred institutions are shaped by the very human hands that guide them. If you think the Vatican's reach stopped with medieval kings and World War II regimes, the next vault might surprise you. One of the most secure sections of the archive documents the Vatican's involvement during the Cold War. Yes, the Cold War. Inside those boxes are telegrams, memoranda, and meeting transcripts that show the Holy See wasn't just praying, it was maneuvering. Carefully, silently, but unmistakably. I remember the first time I was allowed into the file marked Polonia 1970 to 1985. It was thick with dispatches, handwritten reports, and even receipts. These papers detailed how the Vatican covertly supported Poland's solidarity movement, a nonviolent uprising against communist rule. Many people know Pope John Paul II was Polish and supported solidarity, but few realize just how involved the Vatican became. It sent money, printing equipment, moral support. In a memo dated 1981, Cardinal Casaroli scrawled in the margins, "This is not only about faith. This is a moment of survival." They weren't just watching, they were moving pieces on the board. And it wasn't only Poland. A confidential file from Argentina during the military dictatorship of 1976 to 1983 tells of secret letters from bishops reporting torture, disappearances, and the murder of priests. In one telegram from Buenos Aires, a cardinal wrote about Father Carlos Mujica, a priest assassinated for defending the poor. The Vatican's response: "We cannot publicly take sides in an internal conflict." In public, the Vatican kept its lips sealed. But buried in those archives were quiet efforts, petitions, relocations, interventions that tried behind the scenes to protect lives. In Chile under Pinochet, the pattern was similar. Secret meetings, careful pressure, never a press release, but always in the margins of memos subtle signs that the Church was trying, however cautiously, to help. The Cold War files on the USSR are just as complex. Despite the Iron Curtain, the Vatican managed back-channel communications with Soviet representatives. One report dated March 12, 1962 details a private conversation in Vienna. No grand statements, just a priest and a diplomat talking about religious freedom for Catholics in Soviet territory. And somehow even that was enough to rattle the political landscape. Was the Vatican always on the side of justice? No. One file covers the Franco regime in Spain. The Vatican maintained cordial relations with the dictator for decades. Internal correspondence reveals bishops who disagreed, but ultimately obeyed Rome's orders to maintain diplomacy. A clear reminder, sometimes the Church chose self-preservation over protest. Still, the most sobering material I encountered wasn't about politics. It was about people. Specifically, the files under the heading Casi Disciplinari Riservati, confidential disciplinary cases. This is where I read through page after page documenting sexual abuse cases in the Church, decades before they ever reached the public. One file from 1962 concerned a North American priest repeatedly reported for abuse. The memo from above read, "Transfer immediately. Do not inform local parish. Avoid scandal." There was no warning given to the next community. The same pattern repeated across continents. Ireland, Germany, Argentina, the Philippines. Some files bore handwritten letters from victims. Childlike scrawl. Please don't ignore me. Others simply read, for internal review only. The Vatican has never denied that abuse occurred, but for too long it treated the crisis as institutional, not individual. More about managing damage than protecting the vulnerable. A 2010 internal report admits, "We were so afraid of scandal, we forgot who we were meant to protect." Some changes have been made, stricter policies, new commissions. But when you read these documents, the question lingers. Why did it take so long? And then come the financial files. One thick folder marked Banco e Potere, banking and power details, decades of secret Vatican investments. Wire transfers, hidden accounts, shell companies in Panama. The Vatican wasn't laundering money, but the opacity of its system was designed to avoid scrutiny. One memo from 1985 reads, "Redirect funds to charitable trusts. No public disclosure required." Even more disturbing was the file on Roberto Calvi, nicknamed God's Banker, who was found hanged beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982. The archive holds over 600 pages on the case. Suspicious loans, shadow companies, handwritten warnings from bishops that were ignored. Some pages were even marked to be destroyed. They weren't. The archive kept everything, even VatiLeaks, the 2012 scandal, where Pope Benedict XVI's butler leaked confidential documents, is fully documented. His handwritten confession is preserved in a box labeled Privato non distribuire. I did not betray the Holy Father. I only wanted the Church to know what was happening. The leaked papers exposed corruption, cronyism, cover-ups. And yet the most damning thing was not the content. It was how long the silence had lasted. One priest once told me, when I asked why these damaging documents were preserved, "Because truth doesn't belong to us. It only passes through us." And that's when I realized the Vatican archives are not there to erase the past. They're there to hold it imperfect, unresolved, and fully human. In a quiet, locked room called Sub Secreto Pontificio, under papal secrecy, I came across one of the most emotionally complex collections in the archive: personal letters by popes. Never sent. Never read by the public. Marked non-inviate, not delivered. One letter written in 1917 by Pope Benedict XV was addressed to the leaders of Europe at the height of World War I. It pleaded for a ceasefire, for mercy for the soul of humanity. But it was never sent. A note in the margin warned, "If they ignore this plea, your holiness will appear weak." So the letter was shelved. Another file marked Riservato per conclave contained memos written by outgoing popes to their successors. One penned by Pius XI in 1938 warned about the rising tide of fascism in Germany and Italy. He wrote, "If we are silent, history will not speak of our wisdom. It will speak of our complicity." He died before the memo could become a public encyclical. One of the most heartbreaking letters I read was from Pope John Paul XXXIII, 33-day Pope. It was a handwritten draft outlining a complete financial reform of the Vatican. At the bottom he'd written, "The Church cannot preach purity if it is not transparent itself." He died before it was acted upon. No foul play is recorded. But the timing still casts a shadow. Even Pope Francis, the Reformer, has left behind notes not shared with the world. One addressed to a disgraced cardinal reads, "The sin of one does not destroy the Church, but covering it up does." The debates about forgiveness, about transparency, are still happening, even now. The Vatican archives do not hide these truths. They keep them in waiting. Because sometimes humanity isn't ready to confront everything at once. The most sacred room I ever entered bore no name. Just a Latin phrase etched above the door, "Veritas temporis est," truth belongs to time. Inside there were no documents, only a desk, a chair, and a blank book. "This is where questions stop," the archivist told me. "This is where we listen." And that's what I leave you with, not answers, but the call to listen. Because in the quiet of those pages, I found no conspiracy, no perfect narrative. Just people, flawed, frightened, brave, and faithful, trying to carry the weight of truth, sometimes failing, but never forgetting. If this story moved you, if you believe in patient, unvarnished storytelling, please consider subscribing. Not for me, but for the stories still waiting in the dark. Stories that remind us that even in silence, history speaks. And when it does, we must be ready to hear it.